According to hard determinism, if determinism is true, then we do not have free will and we can't hold people morally responsible for their actions. But what if determinism is false? If determinism is false, does that automatically mean that we have free will and we can hold people accountable for what they do? That's not immediately clear. What we're going to do now is look at what's known as the dilemma of determinism. And this is going to be an additional argument for hard determinism. So the question I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we continue through this video is simply this: does free will require determinism? Now let's move on to the dilemma of determinism in more detail. The dilemma of determinism aims to show that free will is impossible. And if free will is impossible, then we cannot justifiably hold people accountable for their actions, right? So that's, again, this view called hard determinism, which is a version of incompatibilism. If hard determinism is true, incompatibilism would also be true. Hence, free will and determinism would not be compatible. So what exactly is the argument then? The first premise says either determinism is true or not. That looks like it's going to be just a logical truth. The second premise says if determinism is true, then we do not have free will. The third premise tells us if determinism is false, we still do not have free will. Therefore, either way we look at it, we do not have free will. But what exactly does this really show? Remember, this is going to be tied back to the question of whether or not we can justifiably hold people morally accountable for their actions. So the first premise here says, if we do not have free will, then the principle of alternative possibilities is false. Second premise, if the principle of alternative possibilities is false, then we are not justified in holding people accountable for their actions or responsible for their actions. Third premise, or the conclusion here, would just be we are not justified in holding people morally responsible for what they do. So that seems to be why the dilemma of determinism seems to be so problematic. So basically, either way you look at it, whether determinism is true or whether it's false, we don't have free will. We don't have the ability to choose otherwise, and we can't hold people morally accountable for their actions. But why should we accept this argument? What support can we give for these premises? Let's look at the first premise. Remember, I said that's just a logical truth. That's like saying A or not A, right? That has to be true, because if we were to say A and not A, that would be a contradiction. So the negation of that has to be true, A or not A. The second premise is supported by considerations of things like human biology or the sort of social, maybe psychological factors that are outside of our control. Remember our discussion of nature versus nurture. We could also point to previous considerations like the consequent argument. Remember that argument says that the laws of nature or the physical facts are outside of our control. And of course, the facts of the past are outside of our control. So we are not in control of these things, which means we're not in control of our actions or our choices either. And the third premise is supported by considering what the world would be like if determinism were false, or if indeterminism were true, right? Remember, we considered that sort of situation, and it looks like that would not be sufficient to give us the kind of free will needed for moral responsibility either. And so if the third premise is also true, then it looks like we don't have moral responsibility, right? Even when we considered quantum mechanics in the courtroom sort of case, it looked like in order to hold people morally accountable for their actions, determinism of some form needs to be true. So now when we recall our discussion of the principle of alternative possibilities and how that relates to moral responsibility, when we're keeping these things in mind, it looks like hard determinism is going to be true. Now, let's think about how we might respond to this sort of argument. It looks like if one wants to reject the dilemma of determinism, what they're going to have to do is either reject one of the premises by showing that it's false or unsupported. Maybe we could do this by appealing to some form of libertarianism. We haven't said anything about what that view says yet. We'll talk about that in a future video. Or we might try to show that we can still hold people morally responsible for their actions, even if it turns out that they could not have done otherwise. So even if the principle of alternative possibilities is false, we can still hold people responsible. We'll say more about what that sort of view looks like in a future video, but essentially what it amounts to is some version of compatibilism that says determinism is true and we can still hold people accountable for their actions. These are the sorts of views that we're going to need to think about next. So that's what we're going to turn our attention to in the future videos.